What if the reason you've always felt slightly out of step with the world around you isn't because you're disconnected from reality, but because you're seeing more of it than most people ever will? What if the quiet sense you've carried for years that something beneath the surface of everyday life is being missed, overlooked, unsaid, isn't paranoia or overthinking? What if it's clarity? You've felt it before. You're in a conversation and something doesn't add up. Not dramatically, not obviously, just slightly. A gap between what's being said and what's actually true. And everyone around you nods along, satisfied, while something in you sits with the discomfort of knowing the picture isn't complete. Or you watch the way a situation unfolds, at work, in a relationship, in the news, in the world, and you see the pattern underneath it, the why behind the what, the invisible thread connecting things that, on the surface, appear to have nothing to do with each other. And you think, surely other people are seeing this too, but they're not. And so you've learned a particular kind of quiet. The quiet of someone who has stopped trying to point at what they see because pointing never seemed to change what anyone else was looking at. You've learned to hold your perception carefully, privately, sometimes even suspiciously, wondering whether you're seeing something real or whether you've simply been thinking too much again. Meanwhile, the world keeps moving, confident, uncurious, unbothered by the questions that won't leave you alone. So what is actually happening in a mind like yours? Why do some people seem to move through life on the surface of things and others can't help but feel the depth pulling at them constantly? By the end of this, you'll understand the 4 distinct ways of perceiving reality that separate the people who sense the deeper truth of the world from those who never think to look for it. Why each one carries its own particular weight and its own particular gift, and what it actually means about you if one of these feels uncomfortably, unmistakably familiar. Let's begin with the first, because it's far more surprising than most people expect. Here's what most people assume about someone who sees the world differently. They assume it's a perspective, an opinion, a lens shaped by experience or bias or a particularly difficult childhood. They assume that with enough conversation, enough exposure to other viewpoints, enough time, that person will eventually come around to seeing things the way everyone else does. What they don't consider is that for some people, the difference isn't a matter of opinion at all. It's a matter of perception. The first type of person who knows the truth about the world is what psychologists describe as the pattern recognizer. This is the person whose brain is wired, genuinely neurologically wired, to detect structure beneath chaos, to see the recurring shape of things across time, across contexts, across relationships that on the surface appear completely unrelated. Think of it like this. Most people look at a forest and see trees. The pattern recognizer looks at the same forest and sees the network, the root systems connecting them underground, the way the older trees are feeding the younger ones, the invisible conversation happening beneath the soil that makes the whole thing function as one living system. They're not imagining it. The network is real. They're simply the ones who thought to look below the surface. In human terms, this looks like the person who saw the dynamic in a friendship group long before anyone else acknowledged it, who recognized the pattern in a relationship after the 2nd incident, not the 7th, who watched a situation at work unfold exactly the way they quietly predicted it would months before it happened, and said nothing, because they'd learned that saying something rarely changed the outcome. The weight of pattern recognition isn't the seeing, it's the knowing before others are ready to know. It's carrying a timeline in your head that nobody else is living on yet. But here's the implication most people miss. Pattern recognizers are not pessimists. They are not cynics. They're people whose brains are running a longer calculation than most, integrating more data points across more time with more precision and arriving at conclusions that feel uncomfortable only because they're early. But this still doesn't explain a different kind of truth-seeing, one that isn't about patterns at all, but about people. Here's what most people assume about someone who reads others with unsettling accuracy. They assume it's intuition, a gift, something mysterious and unearned that some people simply have and others don't. But psychologists who study interpersonal perception have found something far more specific happening beneath what we casually call intuition. The second type of person who knows the truth about the world is the emotional decoder, someone whose nervous system has been trained, often from a very young age, to read the invisible language that runs underneath every human interaction. Not what people say, what they mean, not how they present, who they actually are. This is the person who walks into a room and immediately knows which relationships in it are strained, who can hear the history between two people in the way they don't look at each other, who listens to someone speak and hears clearly, almost involuntarily, the fear or the longing or the unhealed wound living inside the words. Think of it like having a second channel of hearing. While everyone else is listening to the broadcast, the emotional decoder is picking up the frequency running underneath it, the one nobody officially broadcast, but everyone is quietly transmitting. This doesn't mean something is wrong with you. It actually means your brain developed one of the most sophisticated social capacities known to psychology: the ability to process emotional information at a speed and depth that most people's nervous systems simply aren't calibrated for. The exhausting part isn't the decoding, it's the diplomacy of pretending you haven't decoded anything, of sitting across from someone and meeting them where they say they are rather than where you can clearly see they actually are. That gap between what you perceive and what you're permitted to say, that is where the second type of truth seer quietly lives. And yet, as precise as pattern recognition is, as intimate as emotional decoding is, neither of them touches the deepest layer of all. Because there is a third way of knowing the truth about the world, and it doesn't come from the mind at all. Before we go deeper, if you're finding this valuable, subscribe to Psi Nova Mind and turn on notifications. Every week, we uncover the hidden psychological patterns that quietly shape the way you think, feel, and behave. But the third type, this is the one almost nobody talks about. And once you understand it, you may never look at your own knowing the same way again. Here's what the world tends to do with people who know things they can't fully explain. It pathologizes them. It calls them anxious, oversensitive, irrational. It asks them to produce evidence for something that doesn't arrive as evidence. It arrives as knowing, as a feeling in the body before the mind has caught up, as a certainty that exists before the proof does. And so these people learn early and quietly to distrust themselves. But what if the distrust was the mistake? The third type of person who knows the truth about the world is what psychologists and researchers in the field of embodied cognition call the somatic knower. This is the person whose body processes truth before their conscious mind does, whose nervous system registers something real, a threat, a misalignment, a moment where what is being presented and what is actually true are not the same thing, and sends that information not as a thought, but as a sensation, a tightening in the chest, a drop in the stomach, an inexplicable resistance to something that looks, on paper, completely fine. Most people override it. They rationalize it away. They tell themselves they're being dramatic or paranoid or unfair. They go ahead with the decision, the relationship, the room, and later, often much later, they find out the signal was right. The somatic knower doesn't override it as easily, not because they're more fearful, but because the signal is louder, more insistent, more physically undeniable. Their body has learned to be a more precise instrument than their culture ever taught them to trust. Think of it like this. Imagine two people standing in front of a door. One person sees a door, the other person sees a door and feels in their bones that something on the other side of it is not what it appears to be. Both of them are receiving the same visual information. Only one of them is receiving the whole message. The four things the somatic knower's body might be telling them and almost never gets credited for are these. It might be registering an incongruence between someone's words and their energy, and misalignment so subtle it never shows up in the transcript of a conversation, but lives unmistakably in the room where it happened. It might be carrying the accumulated wisdom of every similar experience that came before, a kind of biological memory that knows this pattern, has felt this before, and is trying to protect against the outcome it remembers. It might be sensing something about the environment itself, a collective emotional temperature, a shared unspoken tension, a truth the group is avoiding that the body picks up like a barometric shift before a storm. Or it might simply be the deepest part of the self communicating, the part that knows before the mind can justify it what is aligned with who you truly are and what is not. That is not irrationality. That is intelligence of a different order, an older order, one that existed long before language gave us the ability to argue ourselves out of what we already knew. And when the somatic knower finally stops fighting their own body, when they extend to their sensations the same credibility they've been taught to reserve only for logic, something profound happens. They stop being confused by the gap between what they feel and what they're told to feel. They start trusting the instrument they were born with. That single shift changes everything because you stop looking outside yourself for confirmation of what your own body has already told you is true. So let's bring it all together. There are 4 types of people who know the truth about the world, and by now, you've met 3 of them. The pattern recognizer, who sees the structure beneath the surface of things before anyone else thinks to look. The emotional decoder, who hears the frequency running underneath every human interaction, the real conversation beneath the spoken one. And the somatic knower, whose body registers truth before the mind has found the language for it. And then there is the 4th type. The 4th type is the one who contains all 3 and has learned through years of quietly seeing what others miss to integrate them into something the other types alone cannot access. Not just perception, not just feeling, not just knowing. Wisdom. Psychologists who study post-traumatic growth and what they call self-transcendent awareness have found something quietly remarkable about people who have spent years navigating a world that didn't always validate what they saw. The repeated experience of perceiving something true and being told they were wrong and then watching reality confirm what they already knew does something to a person. Over time, slowly, in ways they rarely get credit for. It builds a kind of epistemological humility, a deep, earned understanding that truth is layered, that reality has dimensions most people never slow down enough to feel, that the most important things about people, about situations, about life almost never announce themselves loudly. They whisper. And the fourth type of person has spent a lifetime learning to be quiet enough to hear them. This is the person Carl Jung was pointing toward when he wrote about individuation, the long, often painful process of becoming so fully yourself that you stop needing the external world to confirm what your inner world already knows. The person who has moved through enough confusion, enough self-doubt, enough moments of, am I the only one seeing this? To arrive finally at a place of quiet internal authority. Not arrogance, not certainty, something more honest than both. A settled relationship with their own perception, a willingness to hold what they see, gently, carefully, without forcing it on anyone, while remaining open to the possibility that even the deepest seeing is always incomplete. Because here is the truth underneath all four types. Seeing more than others doesn't make you better than others. It makes you responsible in a way most people never have to be. Responsible for what you do with what you perceive, whether you use it to connect or to withdraw, whether you let it make you compassionate or cynical, whether you carry it as a burden or as a lantern. The people who truly know the truth about the world are not the ones who are certain. They are the ones who are awake, who keep asking, who never fully settle into the comfortable numbness of assuming they've already seen everything worth seeing. You don't have to have all the answers. You have to stay willing to keep looking, even when looking is lonely, even when it's exhausting. Even when the world around you seems perfectly content to stay exactly where it is. That willingness, that quiet, persistent refusal to look away, that is the rarest form of courage there is. The people who know the truth about the world are not special because they were born different. They are awake because they chose, again and again, in small and unremarkable moments, to keep paying attention. And that is never a flaw. That is, in the deepest sense, what it means to be fully alive.